Hello out there, people in the internet and podcast and video world. Welcome to our Live on Leadership today on Tuesday, May 3rd, with my very special guest, Nicole Baker Fulgham. Nicole, welcome.
Thanks.
Nicole and I go way back. So for those of you who don't know me or who I don't know yet, my name is Beth and I work with leaders as a coach, consultant, and expert in helping leaders in mission-driven organizations reach their goals by removing and navigating the obstacles of leadership. And so I love thinking about leadership. I love thinking about all the complexities that are there. And so I do these lives as a way to kind of learn about the lessons of leadership from different perspectives and what people's journeys have been like. And Nicole, our journey started over, 10, 20 years ago, maybe not 20 years ago when we first met, but a long time ago we met, I believe in my second go round to Teach for America in the late 2000s. I don't know what you call that decade.
The aughts, I think they're the
Yes, exactly. The late aughts. When we were both working Teach for America together and our paths overlapped a little bit. And you're someone I have long admired. You always are really clear. You're really compelling. You're really impactful. And so the chance to get to talk to you today is just a pleasure. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate it.
Well, so great. So today's topic is kind of where faith and leadership overlap. And this idea really came, I think this year, Passover and Easter are usually around the same time, given the lunar calendar and the role that, and the way that Passover, Easter overlapped at its inception, but Ramadan also overlap with it. And so it really had me thinking a lot about faith and the role that, what does that mean to lead? With part of your faith identity, how does leadership potentially look different there or similar? And so we'll talk about that because of the great work you've done at the Expectations Project and just generally. And we had even some good conversation thinking about the role, the difference between when you enter into something that becomes part of your identity versus when that is a part of who you are from maybe before consciousness even, right? Yeah. So I think that'll be exciting. But first, I would love to talk just more generally about leadership, if that's okay with you, before we dig into our area. So you are just a really impactful leader, Nicole. Like, I just feel like you have always had these like clarion calls to action and really compelling. And I remember feeling like whenever you were involved in something I was in, because our circles didn't totally overlap, but kind of would occasionally overlap, I always felt like solutions ensued. Do you have like a magic spell you want to share with us? Or was there like something, the Harry Potter world? Like,
yes, exactly.
What's the secret to that? How did you make that happen? How can we learn from that?
I think for me, first of all, thanks again for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk about issues, and I'm sure I'll learn from engaging with you as well. I think for me, part of the approach that I take with leadership and with just people management is I have just such a strong belief that the people that we work with we hire, brilliant people. They themselves have solutions already, right? To the problems that we're trying to solve, whether it's we're working together on a staff or the problems sort of writ large in society, right? The communities that we're working with and partnering with have the solutions, right? So that's I think one of the ways that I approach the situations. And so as a result, it's not sort of me always trying to come up with what do I think the right answer is. It's really like, let's look at who we have here. Let's discuss what the sort of core issues are. What do we think the root challenges are? And then what are the most logical solutions that are likely going to get us there? And so I think my role has been more helping pull out and sort of identify and analyze from like a big picture lens. Okay, these are the three things we said are going on. These are potential solutions. From my perspective, as someone sometimes who's not in the weeds with the problems, you can bring a different lens. That tends to be sort of the place where I weigh in. But again, I think if you have the right people and are really listening to what's going on, people often have the solutions. And our job as leaders is to help sort of look at the strategy and support our team to get there.
And that makes me think a lot, particularly about what you just said about kind of often people have the answers, communities have the answers, right? And so how do we listen, bring that big picture perspective, right? Or that sometimes when you're so close, it helps to pull back and underline and facilitate that. That is really fantastic. Is there something that, you've been a leader for many years. Many years. Yes. It's a shocking amount of years, I think. But, what used to work for you in leadership that maybe doesn't anymore? Either a place where you've kind of had to grow and adapt something that served you before, but really doesn't serve you anymore?
Yeah, I think when I first started and had my first leadership role, which was way back, a million years ago, without honestly, well, when I say leadership, this would be when I'm managing other people. I think
Mhm.
you and I were both teachers, and I think that is a form of leadership, right? I think we're
Mhm.
in different stages, but the first more formal role where I was managing team members is I did focus almost solely on the goals and the outcomes, right, that we were trying to accomplish, which again is always something that I think we should have a clear sense of where we headed. But I think I didn't spend as much time really investing in the relationships with the people I work with. And by
Mhm.
investing in relationships, I don't look, I think people should be comfortable sharing whatever they do or don't want to about what's going on in
Yeah.
their life outside of work. It's not, so much that we all need to be, best friends and tell each other everything, but it's something to me, it means something different. And I undervalued that, I think,
Mm.
as a newer leader, because I was very focused again on those outcomes, and like the goals that we have are so important. They're connected to kids and communities and education. So like, why wouldn't I focus all
Mhm.
the energy on that? But again, when you're leading a group of people, there are people involved who have lives and ideas and thoughts and sort of humanity, right?
Mm.
And the more hard charging that we can be around, or I could be around goals, I think lessened the humanity of
Mhm.
the work itself and the people involved in the work. And so I think I've definitely learned over time, that building relationships, um, that foster healthy work environments is really just key. And I think if we haven't learned that, gosh, during the last 2 years with everything that's going on in the world and the way we've all had to mesh all of our work and personal together,
Mhm.
this was a good time to learn that lesson or relearn it.
Yes.
But for me, again, I think that arc of not always just focusing on the outcomes and the work itself, but making sure that I'm really tapping into the humanity of the people that I work with was really key for me.
Mm. Absolutely. And I think what you describe is something that a lot of people go through, right? Particularly when they take on those managerial roles in the first time, can feel like, okay, we've got these goals, we've got this outcome, but really, yeah, I think the last 2 years have helped highlight that for all of us again.
Yeah.
So as
Yep.
we are in our little bubbles and our little Zoom rooms, for sure.
Yep.
Sometimes the lessons of leadership are really subtle and they kind of whisper to us so like slowly over time. And sometimes they kind of smack you across the face and like, you're going to learn this lesson now. Are there times you can think about that you learned a leadership lesson in that kind of like smack you in the face kind of way?
Definitely. So one of the roles I had at Teach for America was to oversee our summer training institutes, and we had several of them. I can't remember how many, where we're bringing thousands of teachers to the summer. And so you're standing up, an actual, it was like a city, they had to
Oh,
live,
absolutely.
right, sleep, eat, print their lesson plans and get to the schools where they're doing their teacher training, not to mention all the content they had to learn over the summer to be effective teachers. And we had a situation where at the last minute, we had a couple of the staff that was running that summer training, one of the summer training institutes, couldn't fulfill their roles for a couple
Mhm.
of different reasons. But there were two people, and one in particular, it happened so at the last minute, and there was nothing we could do other than fill the role and obviously fill the role. And the only person available to fill the role was me. And I say this with all humility. This wasn't sort of like, I shall go in and save the day. Like, not at all. It actually, at the time, wasn't something I wanted to do.
Mhm.
But there's no other option. And so I spent most of the summer there at that training institute. And the role, though, was an operations role. And those roles historically are the ones that if it's not done well, everyone knows
Yeah.
because things fall apart and it's a disaster and we're all miserable because, lunch isn't on time or the buses don't show up to take us where we need to go. Um, but it's also one that it's very easy to overlook the importance of it, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's, it's not the super fancy role
Right.
that I think gets all the attention and the love or whatever. And
also
so
when it's going right, no one notices. Like if it's going smoothly, like when lunch is on time and the buses are there and the cotton machine works, it's just the way it is.
You're just invisible in the background, right?
Right. It's tricky.
And so I, certainly knew what the operations team did in theory, right? We did a ton of project planning and prepping and poking holes in our logistics plans to think of the 16 scenarios that we had to deal with. But that's very different than actually doing the role. And I remember walking around the university campus where the institute was held in sweatpants and flip-flops and being up at 3 o'clock in the morning because the printer wasn't working and, getting a car to find the all night, whatever store that had the printer paper or the toner. And it was all of those things that for me, it was what I needed, honestly, to be a better leader of my team because I didn't fully understand all that they had, on their plates. And you never do unless you're doing it. And I certainly learned it then. But it also gave me a degree of, honestly, I think it gave me a degree of humility that I needed, and just roll up your sleeves with everyone and get it done. My relationships were different with the team. You spend a summer together,
You're in that car at 3 a.m.
Different.
Right. Yeah. It's a different kind of bonding than the water cooler. Yeah.
It's different. Right. But it's what I needed. I really, when I look back on my leadership journey, that was one of the seminal moments for me, because it just gave me this get in there, get it done, understand truly like what this experience is, and recognize that as a leader, you are, you have the ability to do a lot of things on and for and with your team. And, that's not always practical. Every leader, I don't recommend doing that, right? But when the opportunities come, or you can seek them out, like be proximate with your team, be proximate with your community that you're working on behalf of. Like that proximity is everything. And for me, that was probably one of the slap you in the face, I think you said, leadership experiences.
Well, it's so interesting, that word. I feel like in the last couple of weeks, I've heard so many people talk about this just as a leader and as a person. It's like, how do you get proximate to the problem, right? And like really just getting up close with it. And I think sometimes my instinct is like, okay, zoom out and big picture. And that certainly has its role, but also there's just something from the up close and personal that teaches you so much in a really nuanced way. So it's interesting for you to use that word, because how sometimes you hear words and they just keep coming up over and over again. I feel like proximate's one of those words lately. So it's right there. Thinking about, equity and justice, I think both of us have been working on causes either directly about justice and equity or proximate to those for a long time. And it's been a really interesting few years, as I think maybe the pace has hastened, thankfully, of some of that, hopefully, knock on all the wood. Yeah. What are you thinking about when you're thinking about issues of equity, issues of justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion? What's kind of on your mind, and what are you thinking about? I know right now you're with the Schusterman Foundation, so I don't know if you're thinking about that in your current role or kind of where you are, but what will help us? I feel like we're on this giant staircase, and it's like, just what's the next step? What's the next step? What's the next step to kind of get to a more just world?
So what I'm thinking a lot about right now, and this came out of the work I did with the Expectations Project, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, but the nonprofit that I led on working on education equity, and then certainly in philanthropy as well, is the idea of where power sits and where it rests, and where it feels almost the unequal power feels almost intractable. And what will it take to move those systems, right? Because it is very easy to make smaller incremental change, right? The things that we are comfortable with, particularly around racial equity, because I think that is still historically in this country probably the hardest. And I don't believe in, playing the, disenfranchisement Olympics to see who has it worse, right? Based on identity or, what other variable, but just the history of race. It's often, called the country's, original sin. And all of that dynamic, that's where I think about it a lot. And what what will people have to give up? Right?
Mm,
What will people have to cede and let go of, and to realize, yeah, if we're ever going to get to that level of true equity where systems are no longer and outcomes are no longer determined or seen based on race, there's going to have to be a shift. And I don't think we've yet reckoned, or even we're not even comfortable, I think, with really talking about that in a lot of settings. And this is not partisan or political. I think across the board,
yeah.
it is uncomfortable for us to have those conversations. So I'm thinking about that a lot. And if we can't, in places where that shift is just going to take too long to happen, what do we do in the meantime? How do we build towards that? And then how do we make things more equitable until that happens?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be complete and holistic. And I try to stay optimistic, honestly, but some days are harder than others
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to maintain that, because I think those entrenched power differentials they've been that way for centuries for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think about that. I mean, it's even thinking, what would it take? I think that is so the right question. And then what would it even take for us to have that conversation in any group of people, right? And are people even comfortable with approaching it? And it's interesting because I think in some ways you're just like, well, geez, if we can't even talk about this, right? But on the other hand, like what might happen if we could start to grapple with this, and what could maybe change? And I don't know, it seems somewhat glacial at times.
It does. And I do think that we are still in this country. I mean, we just look at the conversations that are happening around what we're calling CRT, which is basically
Mm-hmm.
teaching the facts of what happened in this country.
Right. Teaching American history somehow.
It happened. Like, we're not saying you did it, but it happened.
Right.
Like, it wasn't you, but it did happen. But just that the fact that we are struggling to even have those honest conversations about the ways that our current society and structures and organizations and systems are connected to so much of what happened historically.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, I mean, the power piece is one thing. We can't even like talking myself out of even worrying about that. It's like we can't even have this conversation, and it makes so many of us uncomfortable to acknowledge that the systems we're participating in are rooted in like a very like racist, misogynist, like all of that structure. And I don't know how we move forward if we can't begin to acknowledge that, because again, we're going to miss the root of
Mm-hmm.
why the power differential is so strong, why things do feel intractable, because we're not addressing the root cause. We're looking for other fixes on issues of equity, which I don't think are going to get us there.
Mm-hmm. Because you're never really, I mean, it's interesting. It's analogous to what you were just talking about earlier as a team, is you're trying to peel it back, the analysis to the root cause, so you can have the strategy to address it. When we look at this systemically, if we're not able to peel back to that root cause, is everything else a Band-Aid, a stopgap,
Yep.
And I don't know. Some days I'm in the something is better than nothing camp. And other days I'm like, let's just put it all down.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. At the end of the day, I think I'm maybe more of a pragmatist than I like to admit. Or sometimes I wonder if my pragmatism is just resignation and pessimism.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wrestle with it. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think I mentioned that last week we talked to Dr. Tim McCarthy, who's a friend of mine from college, and he's a historian who specializes in abolitionist movements. And so we were really talking too about the impact that the youth have on us, right? Like you look at like a Greta Thunberg, which obviously climate change is a different issue, but like these, or the Parkland activists.
Oh my gosh.
They're fired up and they're ready. And you're like, okay, because maybe this is a little bit of, it's been over 20 years fighting the good fight. I am tired. I'm not seeing the action I want. So how do you look to the youth to kind of energize you and help you move forward? But it's interesting. Next week, we're going to start to focus a lot on different elements of staff culture in these lives. And we have a woman coming on who I've done a lot of work with, who does a lot of diversity consulting with schools. And I was chatting with her casually when she was in town last month. And it was like, how's it going? And she's like, I mean, people are on one side or the other. Either it's like anti-CRT, all this stuff, or you're like, we're just going to ignore this and do the work in our schools. And that's obviously who I work with. But you just think like societally, where is this going if that's where the cleave is? Like,
Doesn't look good.
does not look good.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe transitioning to faith is an appropriate one, right? It's a belief in an unseen reality, right? Like, that's I read a definition of that of faith that really spoke to me about like
Mhm.
loyalty to this idea and this cause, and maybe that's what we need in these moments, right? Is like,
Couldn't hurt.
it's not going to make it worse, which speaks in and of itself now. But I think when we were both at Teach for America in the late aughts, your role was, I believe you were in a different role, and then you transitioned to what was at the time a new role, which was, I believe, the vice president of faith relations, which I remember at the time thinking, oh, this is so interesting because, Teach for America was a secular organization working in public schools. Sometimes I think we have very strong ideas and lines. And I had also come out of 4 years working in the rural South, right? And when I saw how powerful church and faith was as an identity marker. And so it really kind of caught my interest and attention. And so I think maybe that would be a good place to start is, if you have some reflections on kind of what that was like in both a new role and kind of in this larger organization that was well known, and what kind of prompted that and how that evolved.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's so interesting because I think for many people, so my faith identity is Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and I grew up in the Black church tradition, which I think most people, get that connection from, abolitionism to civil rights. I mean, it was just such it's just core to how the work was presented in terms of values, language, sort of calling back to that sort of those biblical themes, and then certainly the church itself was an organizing mechanism. And earlier on in Black life, that was one of the few professions Black people could have, right? Teacher, preacher. There's only a handful, and so it attracted the scholars, the intellectuals to lead the clergy positions, and so that base of organizing and power and a focus on justice was prominent. So that's the tradition I came up in. So for me, going to do something like Teach for America was a direct extension of the faith beliefs and the core convictions that I had been taught as a child, a little Black girl in an AME church in Detroit. That was just what I heard around me a lot. And so when I was at Teach for America, I was in this place where I was having a lot of just conversations with myself about, what is the role of people of faith? I was doing these other roles at Teach for America, but just what is our role as people of faith in education inequality and helping to dismantle it, because it seems so connected, right, again, to this tradition. And certainly there have been churches, mosques, synagogues, temples that have been doing religious institutions, public school partnerships for generations, right? That isn't a new idea. But for an organization like Teach for America, as you said, that had no religious tradition, it is an interesting approach, but the leadership was open to it. So we ended up doing a survey of our alumni at the time to see if there were people like me. I had a theory in a lot of it, that there were a lot of us from all religious backgrounds. And it turns out, I think at the time, it was just over 50%, maybe 54, 55% of the alumni who were surveyed said, yep, my religious convictions were and belief system or values were a main reason why I chose to do Teach for America. And again, it was across the board, across racial lines, religious lines, gender, every type of identity. And so the connections were there. We just hadn't vocalized them. And so it was just an obvious, what should we do? How should we learn more and really partner to find more young people who may want to do Teach for America, but also to build relationships in these communities beyond our teachers that obviously have some type of connection that is spurring that on for a lot of our teachers.
And then you did that for several years and then started the Expectations Project, right? I'm excited to hear about this. I've been admiring from afar for many years.
Thanks. So yeah, I was doing that for a few years at Teach for America, and the questions from the clergy leaders and the leadership in the faith community actually is what drove me to want to start the Expectations Project. So we were working mainly with faith communities on issues that were connected to Teach for America's, things we were doing, right? So getting to know local communities better, finding new teachers from a recruitment standpoint, making those connections. But, when you're meeting with, the pastor of one of the largest, Black congregations in the country, and he asks you, happy to send you young people from our congregation, but what should I be doing about education? Are there policies? I keep hearing about, school funding, or what's up with charter schools? Should I support? I mean, just the questions kept coming. And it wasn't something that Teach for America was leaning into because, at the time it just wasn't our focus. And it became really clear that there was a gap and a need to look at not just sort of religious institution and public school partnerships from a tutoring standpoint, which is all great. I mean, tutor the babies, as I always say. But there's a role that these institutions could play in changing the systems and using their power base, their voice, their influence to speak truth to power, and at the local, state, and federal level to impact and influence the decision makers who are, setting policy, practice, decisions across the board. And so that was the genesis of the organization. And so I started it in earnest in 2012. And it really was all the things with a startup, challenging. You have to raise money, and, how do you really narrow your strategy? And you have to try a few things and learn over time what does and doesn't work, but which we did all of that and then some. But I'm happy to say that the organization still exists today. I was able to transition it to an amazing new president, Zakiya Jackson, who was vice president with us for several years. She is an amazing leader in her own right. And I think one of the key things with leadership is to recognize as well when your season of leading something is done.
Yes.
And I happily stepped aside, right? It was bittersweet, right? Because it's something, you saw from the beginning, but to leave and to have the organization have, at the time, 45,000 advocates around the country who are taking action. And, there's a track record of policy change in the states and districts we had been working in, and even influencing federal education policy. And I mean, yay.
No, I mean, I think that, that I started a school after my time at Teach for America. And I think it's interesting. Two things came to mind hearing you talk. One is that one of our biggest champions was the pastor of the largest Black church in the city of Chicago, who also later became our landlord and who was a state senator at the time. Right. And so this was really, it was where and Reverend Meeks he is wonderful. And, from recruiting students to get in the door to what should our policy be in Springfield on this. And so it's interesting to see where that intersection is. So I can imagine there are many people like him across this huge country. Even I think, as a leader, it is, what's my season, right? And when is it time to pass the baton to someone who can help? I got it from, idea to reality and all these advocates. And now where's the next one? So that's part of it as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just think I have no doubt that Zakiya will do something that I would not have been able to do. Right? Because she's bringing her perspective, her voice, her insight, her brilliance to this work. And I'm just happily cheering her on.
Exactly. I will be the cheerleader and the advocate. And exactly. Exactly. Well, it's interesting because I think that, when like we talked about at the beginning, often your faith identity is formed at a very young age, growing up in the church or growing up in this area. And that's different than, groups, like leading a school where people choose to attend, right? I know I believe you're a proud University of Michigan alumni. I don't know if there are any other kind of alumni. But right, like you choose to be a Wolverine and that is a part of it, right? And if that's not for you, you choose something else. Whereas with faith, it really is so seminal to someone's identity. And so I wonder, is there anything when you're leading a group around that identity that makes it different, or any of the challenge of leadership shift or working with people? Because this is not a, professional, like it's not an identity you can maybe put on and take off when you go into work, right? Or go to school. It is really kind of part of who you are at your core in many cases.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question. So I think a couple of things. One, for people that have a faith identity, all the research that, places like Pew, look at this and, to what extent is it a significant part of someone's, life and what they do on a daily or weekly basis. For people of faith, if it's something that you're leaning into, it tends to be very strong, right? And so that I think is an interesting way of thinking about it, right? And so I think in our country, like given the history of how sometimes religion and faith communities have, people would say, been used to oppress others, right? Not
Mhm.
just people. I think that's like a fact, right? It has been, right? I can't deny
Speaking of
that.
just the history and the plain facts, right?
Right. That I think it can make us uncomfortable to sort of name that. But at its best, right, I think it is these threads of justice and equity are just
Mhm.
across every religion, every religious sort of doctrine and framing. And so if we can lean into that, knowing that it's going to be a strong identity for people and we can pull out that thread, it's a huge motivating factor for people to get involved, right? When we can
Mm.
connect issues in a really honest, authentic way, excuse me, to someone's faith tradition and their values, the return tends to be higher in terms of activity. It
Mm.
tends to be
Engagement.
longer. It becomes more personal for people, and I think we shy away from that more than we should in this country. Again, for very valid reasons, right? I get that, and it can be uncomfortable and oppressive, right?
Mhm.
The flip side is it again can be liberating and really be a north star for a lot of people. So I'd say that is probably the biggest sort of distinction or biggest opportunity that I saw with putting faith at the forefront.
Mm.
On a personal level, it does. I talked about my internal faith more than I ever had, right? For 10
Mm.
plus years, at Teach for America in the role, and then leading the Expectations Project. Um, One has to be comfortable
Mm.
finding some way to articulate what that means, and I always have been. So that worked out fine for me, but everyone, for a lot of people, their faith is private, right?
Mhm.
Which is
Mhm.
completely fine too, right? And so how do we sort of balance that, and how do we do this work in a way that still maintains inclusivity, which really matters, right? And doesn't make anyone feel like they aren't welcome in this space. And
Mhm.
I think the team at the Expectations Project had, and I think is currently really working actively to make sure that that continues to happen.
Mhm. 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 It's interesting. Um, any other thoughts on how the challenges of leadership may shift? Were there different challenges? Or just really kind of, I mean, in some ways, when I think about leading, it's really about like getting a group of people kind of around an idea, right? And in some ways, there's like you mentioned those built-in mechanisms, right? That's like it's not a hard sell. It doesn't take a big push, right? Or whatever the places might be.
I think it's interesting when you're tapping into faith communities and people's faith identities. Again, super strong identity. Super strong identity means it's a super strong identity. And if you're trying to pivot, right, and bring people along into something that making connections that they hadn't made before,
Mm,
in their own sort of conception of their faith tradition, which no faith is a monolith, right? People have all different,
right.
ways they interpret it. That can be really, really hard. And so we ran into some very entrenched um, belief systems that I would say are probably intermingled with other parts of our identity, Americanism, nationalism, race, gender, equity.
Mhm.
But when it's talked about in the guise or, from someone's perception as their faith, that is a very hard thing to try to move, right?
Dissect. Right, right. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And if you have never thought about, what your, faith tradition has to say about, racial equity and education, and it seems to you to not even be a part of the conversation, like, the sort of, nice idea that, which I don't know if this is true. I'm not a I'm not a theologian, but God doesn't see color, right? Like if that's sort of your lens, then, and that's what you believe from your faith tradition, it's going to be really hard to get individuals who believe that to want to engage on racial equity in schools, because you're just not even at the same starting point. And so there were more times than I would have imagined that we pivoted to being comfortable just knowing that, which I think honestly any advocacy organization should be comfortable knowing that you're not going to get everyone to go along with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Resources, go with the people that are already like wanting to like run with you. But there were more times that we had to do that than I initially thought as a leader. I definitely started the organization in the, we're going to tip the people in the middle along and they're all going to come with us. And some of them did, right? But at some point, especially as the country got more polarized, since the 2015 election, it was like, okay, like that's a nice idea.
Right.
I'm exhausted, and it's exhausting to try to, again, help someone think through, as you were saying earlier, like the fundamental faith belief system that maybe they started learning when they were 6.
Right. I mean, to borrow a phrase that seems apt here, like that's not my ministry, right?
That is not my ministry.
Get,
Yeah, I mean, there were people who wanted our organization to work on like, racial reconciliation, like yeah, that's not my ministry. Like that's just a whole other thing. Like we're not equipped to do that. And that's just, I get why that's appealing to want to like bring this into this space, but like, I hope people do reconcile the races, right?
That seems like a great idea. And I mean, again, part of leadership, that's not what we're doing, right? Exactly. Because we're doing, we're working on great schools for kids and great opportunities.
Exactly.
And if we take this on, everything gets harder.
And to get to the place where, as a leader, I was comfortable, as I said, sort of letting go of some of these ideas of who all was going to come along. Like I had to intentionally let go of some of those ideas and being comfortable. And it was always my belief that you center the work, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, around the communities where the disparities are most acute, which in America, by and large, is Black and Brown communities and a few others. But to really say, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that, white clergy can't be centered in this work? It actually does, right?
We've actually got enough centering of whiteness in this country. We can,
and to be comfortable saying that, it took me longer than I had to do a lot of self-reflection. Like, what is holding me back? Like, what's in my head that I've been taught that makes me worry if I do this, we're gonna offend people. If I do this, we're gonna lose funding. All of that is in my head, and that's because I grew up in this country, which you get it in your head, right? But being able to move through that as a leader, and I had amazing staff. Zakia being one of them, who's now leading it, who really pushed, gently. And like we had these conversations, and it does have to be centered. And we were already doing it, but to articulate it and say it explicitly to people was another level for me as a leader. And it was what was needed in the work.
It's interesting because I think that process you're describing of just really reflection and time with yourself and kind of digging and peeling back, I just think is so important. And I find that is so often the work that leaders are doing, right? And they have to be able to say, this is what we're doing and why, because there's just a lot of unearthing inside so that we can lead authentically from that place.
Yeah, I think that's what we should be doing. I don't know that we're always doing it enough. And I put myself in that category too. I've had seminal moments where I've, for a variety of reasons, it's like, the rock and the hard place. You're like, shoot, if I don't figure this out, like, I will not make it. This organization will not thrive. But I don't know that we're always giving ourselves enough space and honestly enough grace. Because it's hard. Like we're going to unpack and look at things about ourselves that are kind of yucky. Like it's just inevitable, right? Like we're all flawed humans and we're all like on a journey to sort of get better. But I think the more that we as leaders can give ourselves the space to do that, we're just going to be better. But I think we're just running, especially when you're running an organization or a school, like you're just like on the churn, right?
Always feels like there's,
It's just on the churn. And I think the more that those of us who are supporting leaders, which, being in philanthropy, I see my role as supporting leaders, for sure now, like what spaces can we curate for them that allow them to do that work? Otherwise, and those of us in philanthropy, right, doing the work ourselves as leaders, like otherwise we're just going to miss it and we're not going to be as our best selves and we're not going to be effective.
it's interesting, the more like just hearing these commonalities come through kind of regardless of sector, regardless of area, regardless of focus, only reinforces those universal truths. So
Absolutely.
all right, well, on to the lightning round of recommendations. This is always fun for me because I get to learn about all these different resources and books and people and amazing things. And I know that our listeners love it as well. But I'd love to hear about a book that has meant a lot to you professionally that you recommend.
So right now I would recommend, I'd probably recommend the 1619 Project essays. I think if you haven't read them, there's just such wisdom they're in the New York Times, but they're also in book form. I always believe in giving an author her or his or their money.
Yes.
But I think it has really helped me unpack a lot of the ways these systems have impacted how we think and function now. So I recommend that just for the current moment.
That's fantastic. It's one of our guests we had a month ago. I don't know if you know Ben Lindy. He was a Teach for America for a while, but I'm not sure you overlap. He's the president of Cincinnati School Board now, and he was a guest about a month ago, and maybe a little more. He just sent out a newsletter. They just said it like flat out, came out and to say like, we believe in teaching this. We're just on record. It like hasn't come up as an issue, but like let the school board show.
I love that he was like, we're going to be proactive before you come for us. We're just going to let you know we're doing it. Yeah.
This is what we're doing. Like this is a middle, look, like he was a middle school social studies teacher, right? So we're going to teach our history. And they specifically cited the 1619 Project because it's been under such, I think it's been, in the other direction as well.
Yeah.
All right. Now I was a reading teacher, so I always think that the answers are in books, but there are other resources people like podcasts, websites, workshops, etc. Is there another type of resource that's been really impactful for you?
Yeah. I have been, I've been reading I've been listening to a fair amount of podcasts, and, there are a couple that really have stood out for me. And I was, I know people are going to be like, what? Like, what's so obscure? But I'm a huge fan of NPR, which is probably like many people listening, I'm sure.
Not that shocking. Yes.
Exactly. But Hidden Brain, with Shankar Vedantam, which I know seems somewhat random, but it looks at social psychology and why people do the things that they do. And for someone who is thinking about how to change, it sounds so, like I'm a puppet master, but how to get people to engage and do things differently.
Right. We want to change systems and change the world. That means people need to do things differently, right? Yes.
And so that has been, even when the topic isn't it's rarely exactly what I'm doing, there's so many lessons that I pick up and apply to my work that it actually surprises me sometimes. And I'm like, gosh, if I ever had to go back to school, I'd probably get a PhD in like social psychology or something. But that's one that has been actually really helpful for me.
Oh, that's great. Great recommendation. I always love this because then I start adding to my feeds and adding that curation. Leadership certainly happens in part. We also all have mentors. So who are some mentors you have that have personally meant a lot to you?
Yeah. And sometimes I feel like people don't even know that they're your mentors, but my very first boss when I worked at the Council of Great City Schools, which is a consortium of the 50 largest public school districts, Miss Sharon, because I feel like I should call her that because she was, I don't know, my mother's age. I'm sure she's not watching. She'll be like, don't out my age. But she was a boss that mentored me, in my role at Teach for America, and I constantly came back to her for counsel because of the way she led and the way she supported me to lead, and she wanted me to be out front. I was newer in the field, and she constantly found ways to help me grow and develop. And so she's someone I went back to often to learn, as I was managing other people, how can I continue to do that? She's also a Black woman. And so we had a lot of wonderful conversations about our identity as Black folks and as women, and navigating a world where most people didn't look like us, who were also in leadership. And she was and has been a wonderful mentor to me over the years.
Oh, that's wonderful. And what a great first professional, it just sounds like it's such an impactful moment in your life. And
I'm so lucky.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Lucky. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then I also think about mentors from afar, where maybe you don't personally know them, but you feel like you learn a lot about leadership from them, just by watching them, reading their books, kind of consuming them. Are there any mentors from afar that you go to?
Yeah, so I don't know Brian Stevenson. I've met him a couple of times, but I'm sure I completely fangirled when I met him. He's like, oh my gosh, Brian. But he's definitely someone that the lessons that he's pulled out of the work that he's doing on criminal justice reform, and particularly, we talked earlier about being proximate. Like, there are just a lot of ways that he leads and talks about leadership and engaging community that for me are ones that I certainly don't get them all right, but he's a model for me from afar.
It's really, yes. And I think does it in a variety of very interesting, like, I think there's just so many interesting pieces
Definitely.
that he does with EGI. So absolutely. And then maybe perhaps a lighter note, what is something you are loving in your life right now?
Oh gosh, that's one of my favorite questions. I think I am loving the pace and the new things I'm learning in philanthropy. Like, I'm getting to read again, and it sounds horrible, like when you're leading an organization, you don't get to do any of those things. But I'm getting to lean into and read things that I just haven't had the space to do. And because I love that, it gives me incredible joy to be able to do that. And that has been something that was unexpected in the role. And I didn't sort of realize, like, oh, I knew I had new things to learn, but I just enjoy that. The other thing I would say, completely not work related, but I've started doing ice skating lessons again.
Oh,
so
wow.
like, one of my joys, I mean, I'm on like level 4 or something. So I'm like,
age is a number. We don't need to do it.
Okay, great. But I have such joy every time I get out there and like try a new skill, and just, I go to practice in between the lessons and glide around out there as best I can. And it just makes me really, really happy.
So, oh, that's so great. Yeah. Did you ice skate as a child or as a teenager?
Nope.
Oh, totally new.
I know, when I say again, like, I did it like maybe like 15 years ago, and then I had my daughter, and then life got busy, and I remember how much I loved it. And I was like, it just makes me so happy. And it's like, athleticism and grace. And I did ballet. That was my thing as a child. So it reminds me a little bit of that. And it just gives me joy. So
absolutely.
I'm just saying, get out there and find a hobby, people.
You really have to be focused, because otherwise you are on your butt. So it really forces you to be so mindful.
I love it. Yeah.
That is really great. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like there are so many gems and so many lessons of leadership, and it really has inspired me. And I'm sure all the folks who are watching and listening in as well. So if you like this and hearing about this and want to be informed about other lives, and there eventually will be a blog post that's inspired by this and a podcast, you can check out my website at bethnapleton.com or follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And I also have a newsletter. So you can go to bethnapleton.com/stay in touch. And that's always where the first information comes out. So I really appreciate this opportunity, Nicole. And I'm just so glad that we got to reconnect in this way.
Me too. This was so fun. Thanks for reaching out. And
thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye.